in 1954 and led the school through 2 decades of growth. The university grew not only in enrollment and national reputation, also spent $80 million in capital construction during the Doran years. His achievements, both personally and professionally, have been recognized outside the state. In 1971, Doran received the Horatio Alger Award, honoring leaders who have overcome humble circumstances to attain unquestioned success. Upon his retirement in 1976, Dr. Doran turned most of his attention to another important part of his life, the ministry. As a preacher in the Church of Christ, he often spoke throughout the region. At several times, he was asked to become a full-time minister, though he decided not to accept the offers. Recognized for achievements both locally and nationally, Adron Doran has made a lasting mark on the Commonwealth. Joining Dr. Doran to discuss his contributions is Dr. John Kleber, professor of history at Morehead State University.
Dr. Doran, you were born in rural Graves County in 1909, the son of Edward and Elizabeth Doran, one of 6 sons. What was it like in those early days?
John, I think you would almost have to go to Boydsville, Kentucky, and see the isolated community that existed at that time to understand some of the difficulties and hardships through which we went and some of the sacrifices that we had to make living through subsistence farming to survive with a family like that. Now, one of my brothers died in infancy, but 5 of us lived to be adults and all married. And all of us left the community and went to school or sought employment elsewhere, and none of our family remained in the community.
Well, apparently one of the things you learned to appreciate in those early days was the value of an education. You graduated from Cuba High School and then went on to Hardeman College, where you received an associate degree. And there you went to what was then Morehead State College and received both a baccalaureate and a master's. And from there to the University of Kentucky, where you were awarded a Doctor of Education degree. What instilled this desire in you for these higher degrees to pursue this amount of education?
Well, John, I think what was typical of us was typical of most of the families with whom we grew up. The land where we lived was not productive enough to provide adequate living for all of the people who were there. And my parents decided early, or at least they announced to us early, that our future depended upon whether or not we went to school and we got an education that was adequate for the times. And I think all of that served as a great incentive for us to make the sacrifices that were necessary and undergo some of the difficulties and hardships to get an education.
I think you were greatly influenced by years at Hardeman College. Would you talk to me just briefly about what a role that played in your development?
Well, Hardeman was the first college I had ever seen. Alonzo Williams was my high school teacher, my high school principal, and my basketball coach, and he helped us to organize groups on the campus of the high school. And he had been thinking considerable length of time, evidently, while I was a junior and senior in high school, that I ought to go to college. So when I graduated from high school, he took me to Hardeman College to enroll in 1928 as a freshman. And the first individual I met on the campus was N.B. Hardeman, who was the president of the school. He was a commanding figure indeed, tall, handsome, charming, cultured, well-groomed, moved with authority and decor and decorum and everything that he did. And I think he became more or less my idol for the kind of personality an individual ought to be, and how he ought to apply himself to the opportunities that he had to do so. And I think there are many, many areas, if we had the time and disposition to recite, that not only do his memories still linger with me, but I find myself often thinking about some of the influences that he brought to bear on the school and the student, and particularly on me.
In two areas, I think he had a great influence. You're going to be a great orator. In fact, you said one time, when I'm at my best, there's no one I'd rather listen to than myself. And I've heard that N.B. Hardeman was also a great orator, and that he had this influence on you. Is that true?
Well, he was a great orator, a meticulous student, and a student of words, and a student of putting words together in phrases, and forming paragraphs, and he spoke that just literally flowed. And he had a well-modulated voice. He spoke very distinctly and very accurately, and you could not fail to sit at his feet for 2 years, which I did, and then later, when he came into communities to preach, I always heard him preach. You couldn't have experience with him that you did not also picture yourself in his position making a speech.
I think he had influence on you in another capacity, in the fact that he was very interested in Tennessee walking horses, got you interested in Tennessee walking horses. And then you went on to win a national championship in horsemanship for amateurs over the age of 60. Someone said you were rewarded at that time for horsing around. Are you still riding?
Well, I'm still horsing around, I guess, John, but I am not. I'm not riding. I grew up going to his stables when I was a student. I grew up seeing him ride in horse shows, and I thought if I ever reached the point that I could ride a Tennessee walking horse like he did, and win as he won, that it would be a happy occasion for me. So in 1975, I took Hawks Mystery down to Shelbyville, Tennessee, and rode in that class that you mentioned. And I won the class, the same one that Hardeman had won some 30 years before. So he did have a great influence on that recreational facet of my life, too.
Dr. Doran, in the time since you left the presidency, you have preached extensively. Indeed, this role of you as minister in the Church of Christ is a separate but equally important dimension to your life. How did you come to preach?
John, I appreciate your observation, because in all of the things that I have done, my church relation has been paramount. I've never neglected the things that I was challenged to do in my jobs and in my business for the church, but I've never neglected the church to do other things either. I grew up in that kind of environment. But Alonzo Williams, who I mentioned a while ago, was my high school principal, my basketball coach. And he also organized a male quartet in the high school. And I sang baritone in this quartet. He thought I had developed into a pretty good singer. So when I graduated from high school and went to Freed Hardeman, he announced in some of the church papers that I'd be available to sing for revival meetings during summertime. And of course, the Church of Christ does not use instrumental music, as you know, in its meetings and worship, and it's all a cappella, which focuses attention on the fellow who leads the singing in the meeting. And so he got some congregations to ask me to lead the singing. Well, the old Webb's Chapel Church in Carlisle County, out from Arlington, Kentucky, invited me to come and lead the singing for their meeting. And they had a fellow named W.O. Davis from Texas doing the preaching. And you know, it's hard for some of those longhorn steers from Texas to become acclimated to the kind of preaching weather we had in West Kentucky, where the weather was dry and the roads were dusty and the lights were dim and the bugs were plentiful and heavy. So he got tired of this meeting before it was over with. So on Friday night, he announced to the congregation that he was going to close his part of the meeting on Saturday night. Well, some of the elders of the congregation came to me on Saturday morning and said, "We want you to preach Sunday." Well, I said, "I've never preached. I couldn't get up there and preach. Just let me sing." No, I said, "We want you to do a little preaching too." Well, I had sung for meetings for some of the outstanding evangelists of the Church of Christ during that summer, so I'd gotten me some pretty good outlines. And one of the outlines I got was from a fellow named G.D. Nepper from Fostoria, Ohio, who had come down in that community to hold a meeting. And it is a good outline, I thought, and so I put it together. And that Sunday morning, I got up and preached. And after the sermon was over, two youngsters came to make their confession and baptized. And I took the confession and baptized them. And when we went to this old pond and Frank Ebb's horse lot to baptize them, two other people came to be baptized. And that motivated me to think maybe there's something in this business that I can do other than sing, and that sort of put me on my journey to become somewhat of a preacher.
I know that at least on two occasions, maybe more, in your earlier life, you had an opportunity to go into the full-time ministry. Was that ever a serious temptation to you?
Yes, John, it was. It was one with which I labored, Mignon and I both labored diligently to make that decision. But there were so many factors involved. I just did not like the role of a professional preacher. I just didn't want to be stereotyped. To be confined to that area of endeavor, which often, at that time at least, separated you from the activities of the community, the economic and the social and fraternal and educational enterprises of the community. And then there was so much confusion within some of the congregations I knew that I did not want to place myself in conflict all of the time. So we decided that we could do better in education and the ministry than I could in the ministry alone or education alone.
Was it difficult for you during your career to separate and at the same time keep a balance between your interest in education, politics, and religion?
Well, I really never was conscious of any conflict or any difference. When I was a high school principal, I refused to preach in the community where I was high school principal. I preached elsewhere. Somebody would become offended or think that I was binding the two together. And there was never any conflict at all with what I did on Sunday and what I did the rest of the time.
In August of 1931, after a whirlwind courtship, you married John McLean. For more than 60 years, you have been a team. In fact, someone said Morehead got for the price of one. You administered, and she saw to the personal development of the students. Is this an accurate description of your working relationship?
Well, we did have a whirlwind courtship. I lived at this little community at Cuba in Graves County, and I lived at Sedalia, which was about 8 miles away. Our families knew each other because Non's father ran a general store in Sedalia, and we'd come over to Sedalia and bring our corn to be ground into meal and our wheat ground into flour, and while there, parents would trade with Manon's father. They knew each other. I played basketball on the boys' team, and Manon played basketball on the girls' team. While we were in high school, we'd see each other, but didn't get very well acquainted. Certainly, we didn't boggle each other's eyes. But in February of 1931, we were attending a basketball game at Sedalia, the district basketball tournament, and we fell in company that day, got acquainted, and sat together in the same area with a with a man friend of mine and a woman friend of hers. And there was just something there that I never had seen in anybody before, and it may have been something in me that she wanted to explore further. So that night, we attended the game together, and she lived across the street, and I walked her home that night from the basketball game and delivered her safely to her parents. Well, that began the courtship. We were both at school at Murray, and we courted every day and every night and most of the time between. And in August, on August 3 of that same year, we were married. Manon has been one of the great influences of my life, John. I grew up in a family with 5 boys, and I missed in that some of the culture and some of the behavior and some of the finesse with roughneck boys that you get if you have girls in that family. And I didn't realize that as much until I married, and there were rough places on me that I was not conscious of that soon rubbed down, and difficulties I was having in some areas of that. But her wise judgment and her sensitivity and her senses of understanding and seeing what I don't see was of great importance. And then her stickability and commitment and security and all that we did without grumbling, without deviation one whit has been a great influence, and it has been a team. And we've had hardships along the way, and she's endured well and has stood up exceedingly well for 60 years hungry, too.
I know those early years were very hard for you all. In fact, those were the years of the Depression, and I've heard stories that you lived in very substantial housing, pulling water out of a well, using carbide lamps. Was it like that in those days?
Indeed it was. Our first job was at a little high school in northern part of Graves County. We went down there, and the only house to rent in the town was a little 3-room gun barrel house. The front room where you had the warm morning stove that burned coal. And the next room was a bedroom in which we had one bed, and the next room was the kitchen eating place in there. And we had this little warm morning stove that heated the whole house. And we had these coal oil lamps and finally carbide lamps that you pumped air into them, you know, that made them lighter, that Manon's father bought for us. And then we had no indoor plumbing. And the principal lived next door, and he had a cistern, and he hauled water from a big well and filled the cistern, and we'd go there and draw water. Well, they were not hard times to us because we didn't know what it was to be poor school teacher and not have much money. Nobody else had any money. And as you said, it was in the depth of the Depression, and there weren't many dollars. So I guess we were living about as well as anybody else was living, but it was difficult to adapt to those low levels of income and economic depravity when we first began.
I think one of the fascinating stories of you all as a team was when you were the principal of Wingo High School and Mrs. Doran was teaching there. And this was the time when you were serving in General Assembly, and when you would be called away to Frankfort during those sessions, she took over as principal of Wingo. Is that right?
Indeed, and did a good job with it. I would always leave home on Sunday night and would go to Frankfort during the session, and we usually adjourned on Friday, and I'd catch the train and go back home on Friday night, and we played our basketball games on Saturday night, and I would go to the place where the basketball game was being held to meet with the team and coach them. She secured the school bus and loaded them up, and she went with them to the basketball game, and I met them there. The early part of this was during the World War II And all of the other teachers had been drafted and gone into the Army, and I was the only man in the institution, and so she had to take over after I left. And one time, some of the dissident girls, I remember, organized a little humorous, facetious protest, and they wrote on placards, "Down with petticoat rule." And they said, "We're tired, we want a man to be principal," and they want me to stay and not be in the legislature, and they didn't want the women running the high school.
I expect nip that in the bud very quickly.
Well, it wasn't very serious to start with, and it didn't get very much momentum.
Dr. Doran, you must be the only man in the history of the Commonwealth, in fact, indeed, I'm certain you're the only man in the history of the Commonwealth, who received a doctorate from the University of Kentucky while he was Speaker of the Kentucky House of Representatives. In fact, I've heard that President Donovan sat in on your graduate committee. Was that unusual?
Well, it is unusual, John, because few people that I've known were willing to work that hard. I was elected to the state legislature in 1943 and had served through the 44 and 46 and 49 session. Well, I came to the university in 1948 to my graduate work and then was reelected to the House in 1949 and elected to be Speaker of the House in 1950. Well, there was a 3-month period there of 60 days, you know, that the legislature met, and I had to preside over the session and then meet my classes at the same time. But my professors were all sympathetic, and they were understanding, and I arranged my classes to where they could eat either early in the morning before I went to Frankfurt, or early in the afternoon after I got through, or at night. And when the time came for me to defend my dissertation, the dean of the graduate school and the president of the university both sat in on my defense of my dissertation. I thought that it was their desire to see to it that if anybody questioned that I got favors, well, they could counteract that by saying, well, the president and the dean of the graduate school sat in on his dissertation, and we know he was not favored beyond other students.
In 1947, you worked very actively in the campaign of Harry Lee Waterfield for governor, and he lost the primary to Earl Clements. Mr. Waterfield believes that the exposure you got statewide at that time was responsible for your selection as the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Is that true?
Well, I think so. You see, he went to every Democratic member of the House in his campaign for Speaker, and I took my automobile and drove him all over the state to see these legislators and the political bigwigs in the state while he was a candidate. Then when we assembled in 44 for the legislature, I knew these representatives as well as Harry Lee knew them, and they knew me as well as they did Harry Lee. And that developed a very strong rapport among us. I remember when I first went to the state legislature in 1944, one of the first bills that I proposed was a bill to raise the tax rate on real estate for school purposes from 75 cents to $1.50. Well, that's doubling the tax rate in that district. Well, we knew we had to have more money. I think one of the reasons that I ran for the state legislature was because of the low level of financing of education in the state. Keene Johnson was governor of Kentucky, and in the last year of his administration, he was leaving the governor with a surplus of $10 million. So many of us thought that if you had $10 million in the treasury, some of that ought to be appropriated to education. Now, following Governor Johnson was Governor Willis. Governor Willis had run on a platform to repeal the income tax. Well, everybody knew if you repealed the income tax that you were going to cut into the financing of public education. And the fellow who ran for state superintendent with him was John Fred Williams. And John Fred talked Governor Willis during the campaign into accepting a proposition that if he were elected, that he would appropriate $3 million retroactively to teachers' salaries during the 43-44 school year. And when I went to the legislature, the administration asked Ed Markham and me. Ed was a Republican representative from Manchester and Clay County, and I was a Democrat, and they asked us to sponsor the bill. Well, we did, and it was passed. And the greatest reward that teachers had had during my lifetime was to split up this $3 million retroactively and increase their pay for the year.
Another man you were very close to was Alvin Barkley. You traveled with Alvin Barkley some, and he's been a great influence on you.
Well, he was a great influence on anybody who ever associated with him, John. I think he was one of the greatest Americans that has ever lived. And he should have been President of the United States. And I think if he had not had a falling out with Franklin D. Roosevelt while he was Majority Floor Leader, that he would have been nominated as Vice President instead of Harry Truman. And when Roosevelt died, he would have been President. As you know, he did not become Vice President until later than that. But Barkley always had a way of going to a courthouse and drawing the politically interested citizens of that county or that community to meet him at the courthouse or out under a shade tree or on the corner of a street and talking to those people just like they were personal acquaintances of his. And that impressed me greatly in those days, that if you have a message and you can get it put together and you can go out and tell the people about it, the people will be interested and support you, and that's how they kept him in office all those years.
I've heard a story that he could sometimes be a long-winded speaker. When he got going, he sometimes didn't know when to stop, and people would hold up calendars indicating that it's time for him to stop his speech. Did he do that?
Well, he was long-winded, and some people have accused me of following that pattern that he did in some of my speeches. I've heard him speak 2 hours without a break at all, and without showing any kind of fatigue or tiredness at all. And he just he knew so much. He had so much to say. And he thought the people in his home district needed to know these things, that he did not weary at all in speaking.
I wish I'd been able to know him or hear him.
A great character.
1951, you leave the political arena to become the director of the Division of Teacher Education and Certification. There are many people in the state who wonder what would have been if you had remained in politics. Do you ever wonder about that?
No, I've never been much to look back, John, and I've never regretted greatly any decision that I ever made. I made those decisions, as you know better than anybody, in cooperation with Mignon, and we made those decisions at that time and never faltered and never looked back. I have no regrets in any of those decisions. Now, I think at that time that to become Speaker of the House is the highest level of leadership that you can be elected to in the House, and I had no particular interest in going to the Senate. But in the House, it was just a bunch of young, learning Turks, and so I'd reached the height of that, and I didn't want to repeat it. And I had no particular interest in going further in it. I hadn't been turned off by politics, but I had seen some of the difficulties involved in being elected to our offices. You had to think politics. You had to eat with a political viewpoint, and all of the people you associated with meant something politically to you, and you found yourself dealing with them from strictly a political standpoint. So I decided that I would get into education, and when Butler had been elected superintendent of public instruction, he offered me the job as director of teacher education certification and secretary of the Council on Public Higher Education, and I accepted it and stayed in it for 2.5 years.
Maybe we could move into that area of your life when you move on from politics to higher education. In fact, when you left the General Assembly, you showed an interest almost immediately in getting into higher education. In 1951, you unsuccessfully sought the presidencies at Murray and Morehead. And then in 1954, when Dr. Spain resigned, you became the 7th president of Morehead State University. At that time, Morehead was in a very bad state of affairs. 3 of 6 presidents had been dismissed. It had briefly lost its accreditation. Why, in the light of these problems, would you want to go to such a troubled institution?
Well, I guess, John, it was the same thing that caused me to want to be Speaker of the House. When I sat there in the House, or when I first went to the House, you looked up at that platform, and there was a big black chair up there. I asked somebody what that was, and they said, that's where the Speaker sits. Well, how do you get to be Speaker? And they told me, and I decided I wanted to be Speaker. I guess I sort of wanted to do what I could do, gravitate to a level of leadership that I thought was better and above what I had. And I guess that's the same thing that attracted me to the field of higher education in the first place, and then to the president in the second place. I had just completed my degree in education administration at the University of Kentucky, and nothing, I guess, motivates you more greatly to do what you've been prepared to do than to look at opportunities that you demonstrate what you have learned to do. Now, I was not as interested in the presidency of Murray. I went in the State Department of Education. And then in 1954, when Dr. Charles Spain resigned and went to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to be dean of the School of Education at the University of New Mexico, the day it was announced, I went to Governor Weatherby and said, Lawrence, I'd like to be president of Morehead. Now, sit here and talk with me about what I can do and what you can do. So out of the conversation came the plans that both of us thought could be perfected. And so on the 6th day of April of 1954, I was elected by a vote of 3-2 as president. That never did bother me either.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because if I could interject here a minute, your selection was not without controversy. Morehead had lost its accreditation in 1947 because of the political interference of Governor Simeon Willis. And Governor Lawrence Weatherby has told me that at the point that he saw that you were elected president by a vote of 3-2, he left the state the next day. This was not a concern to you.
Well, it was no concern to me. It wasn't a great concern to Lawrence in particular. I asked him about, now, won't it be dangerous for you to support a politician to be president of Morehead? And he said, no, sir, he has such standing with the Southern Association and with the Southern Regional Education Board. These are his peers, and they know him, and they're not going to pursue any kind of an investigation. Now, there were 2 vacancies on the board. Times were up, and Lawrence filled those vacancies with 1 Republican and 1 Democrat. Wendell Butler was superintendent of public instruction, and he was chairman of the board. Well, when the time came to make the selection, the 2 people that Lawrence selected voted for me, and Mr. Butler voted for me, and the other 2 people voted against me. One of them came to my office a week later and apologized voting against me. And he said he did it because he thought I was too politically oriented. And I was brazen enough to say to him, well, I know something about your political background. You've been mayor of the city where you live, and you've been a Republican leader in the district in which you live, and I wouldn't think that you would oppose me on that basis. Well, he became a good friend. The other fella resigned from the board, and Governor Weatherby named somebody else. Now, Weatherby laughingly says, facetiously says, that to keep from being implicated in the case, he took a vacation and went to Florida. And this was done while he was gone, but I think he would have stood up and faced it as he did later.
What did you see as Morehead's role in the Appalachian region when you went there?
Well, John, I didn't think that the college had exerted the kind of influence in the region that it should. It had gravitated to a local institution. There were many people in Morehead that thought the college belonged to them. But I felt, as did many individuals in the region, that Morehead ought to be the center of gravity, and that programs ought to be built at Morehead to serve the region, and the resources of the region ought to be mobilized and brought to play on the programs at the university. And as the result of it, I became active in regional enterprises. We had an East Kentucky Planning Commission that really was the forerunner of the National Appalachia program. And this brought counties together and brought problems into focus. That flood conditions were not local. It concerned the whole region. Roads were not local. They concerned the whole region. Education was not local. It concerned the whole region. So I think out of that attitude and dealing with the leaders in eastern Kentucky, we developed a feeling that Morehead State University belonged to the people.
Dr. Doran, when you went to Morehead as president, at that time in 1954 it had a student enrollment of 700. There were 45 faculty members and a budget of $820,000. When you left almost 23 years later, it had an enrollment of 7,400. There were 300 faculty members and an operating budget of $20 million. At one time, there were architects and 8 contractors working on the campus at the same time. Your years coincide with what some called an era of institution building. Those must have been exciting and challenging years, were they?
Yes, they were, John. They were exceedingly challenging and exceptionally rewarding. When you take something that was as far removed from the center of gravity as Morehead State Teachers College was, and then see it grow and develop into a regional university second to none in the nation, it has to be rewarding. And it required a lot of hard work, tireless hours, sleepless nights, travel in the aggregate that would stagger your imagination. But I think Governor Burt Combs did as much as anybody to open up new avenues for us to obtain money to build buildings that we needed, not only because our enrollment had grown, but because it was growing. We spent $80 million on the campus during those 23 years, and indeed we had to get 8 contractors, 8 architects working at the same time, because we had to have these dormitories open by next fall. We had to have this classroom built by next fall. We couldn't wait 10 years with a long-range plan, and it had to be done at that time. So I think the colleges all would say that they had full cooperation from the governor to extend our credit into the market to get the dollars to build these buildings we had.
Seems to me today a president is not really a builder, he's more of a manager. I think that's quite a different kind of situation than you experienced in those years of the 60s and early 70s.
I think, John, it's always been a leadership management program. Now, I've never been impressed with those people who say, well, we've got to have an academician as president of a university, whether it's the regional or the University of Kentucky. Now, I think an individual ought to know that he has achieved in the field of academia. He's just not going in there with an 8th grade diploma or a high school education to manage it like he would a popcorn machine at a picture show or something less than that. He has to have some strong academic preparation for it. On the other hand, he needs some preparation in educational administration. You just do not handle state government like you do a business, and you do not handle institution of higher education like you do a business, though you have to have some business prowess in doing it. But the management role, the leadership role, is far more important today than just plucking an individual out of a successful academic career and making him president.
I'm very interested in looking at your leadership style. I have a deep feeling that Morehead State University was looking for a strong president in 1954, and you certainly provided that strong leadership. From a personal perspective, your style of administering was to delegate little authority, to participate widely in decision-making, to remain knowledgeable of all activities on campus, and to be supremely candid. I think anyone who taught at Morehead, was at Morehead during the years you were president, knew exactly where you stood on every issue. But this sometimes got you into trouble with the press and the faculty. I think this direct, hands-on approach. Can presidents act that same way today, and would you act the same way today if you were president?
Well, John, I think the complexion of both the student and faculty bodies have moved to a greater independence than they represented then. I don't think that the faculty thought it could run the university. I think the faculty thought it ought to have a president that could run the university. And my style would be considered as a hands-on approach. Some of my critics called it authoritarian and totalitarian, and all. We had a student. It was among the students. We had a student one time during the days of protest of the late 60s and early 70s who left Morehead because he didn't like the way the school was being run, and he transferred to Eastern. And he stayed there a semester and came to Morehead. And somebody asked him, said, well, why did you leave Morehead and go to Eastern? Well, he got tired of the way Doran was running the university. Well, you went over there for a year and came back to Morehead. Why did you come? He got tired of the way Dr. Martin was running the university. And somebody asked him, well, what's the difference in the two? He said, well, both despots, but Doran's a benevolent despot. And well, that was the attitude that students had toward that type of administration. But I don't think a president today can move away from his responsibility of knowing what's going on, what ought to go on, and why it's successful and why it's not successful, and to involve as many people as he can in this process. And I would try to do it as well as in the same way I did then, and I think that the president cannot run the institution in isolation. And I went and sat down with the students on the campus. I was in the grill. I was wherever they were, talking with them about their interests and their needs and their dislikes, and then try to do something about it.
I think there was almost a feeling on the campus of an extended family, that we were all in this together, working for the same thing. I think the students felt that, and I believe that's why Morehead students tend to be very close to the institution after they leave and come back years after they've gone.
John, one of the great compliments that the alumni who were students at that time say to me now, and I see them, that they were proud to be at Morehead during the Doran years.
Did you ever say to your faculty that if you don't like Morehead, a train running east and a train running west?
Well, I think they'd taken the train off at that time, but I said to students and parents and faculty and administrators alike, there's a bus going east and a bus going west. That's the only way you can get out of Morehead. Now, that was not as presumptuous, that is, as it has been made to sound later, but I always said to the faculty to the parents that came, and we had a general session on Sunday afternoon to talk to the parents about their freshman youngsters who were coming, and I tried to console the parents that we had never lost a student because of homesickness. They'd get over it and get adjusted, but here are the way we're going to do. Here are the way the faculty has decided, the administration decided, the Board of Regents have decided to run this institution. Now, if you think you don't like that, and if you think your little boy or little girl won't like that, the best thing for you to do is take them back home now, and then you won't have to come back after them. Then we said to the students and all, Now, this is the way the board says it's going to be run, and I'm going to run it that way, and the faculty is going to run it that way. And maybe if you don't like it, you'd be better off if you caught a bus and went home and leave us to our misery, and you leave yourself to your misery. And John and I operated that way under a board that understood, that wanted it operated. When we came to this matter of integration back in 1955 and 56, Lawrence Weatherby was governor, and when the Supreme Court rendered its decision, Governor Weatherby said, we're going to comply with the law. And so I took that to mean that they all did. So we moved into admitting students regardless of race and creed and color or any other demarcation. Well, the board had to approve that decision. So I went to the board with a resolution that said those things. And they discussed it for a length of time. And one of the board said, I just cannot vote for that. I'll have difficulty with my people at home. I'll have difficulty with my mother when I go back home and tell her that I voted to open this institution to all races and colors and creeds. So after we discussed it a long time, I said to the chairman, well, maybe this is a solution to the matter. You entertain a motion to adopt the resolution, and maybe somebody will second the motion. And so then let the minutes show that the resolution was adopted without dissent. And they agreed to that. And so the motion was made, and it's on the books now that it was accepted without anybody voting in the negative, and there was no problem with it, and has been no problem with it since. And as you know, we were the first to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that if I might. And indeed, Morehead State University was the first state college in Kentucky to adopt policy of admitting students regardless of race. It was also the first institution to integrate its dormitories and the first in the Ohio Valley Conference to integrate varsity athletic teams. Did this concern you at all about what this might mean?
Well, I guess I was too, some people call those things courage. There's not much difference sometimes, John, between ignorance and courage. You may have courage to go ahead and do something, or on the other hand, you may go ahead and do something simply because you know the consequences. I don't think I ever anticipated ill consequences, but I always thought it was right. And when the governor said this is what we're going to do, then the president said we're going to do it in our situation. Now, we had difficulty with other schools when we sent black athletes to play football and basketball and run track, but we never did have any difficulty on the campus of doing that. One time I remember they had a wrestling meet down at some institution, some college in Atlanta. And we had a black youngster from New York, and he was a good wrestler. He was a good one. Tough, hung tough. And so when we sent in our registration and our eligibility list, Lieutenant showed up as a black student. And the manager of the event called me and said, you got a black man on your team, haven't you? Yeah, yes, sir. Well, now, if you come and participate, you'll have to leave him at home. And I said, no, sir. If that's the choice, we'll stay at home because we don't have any second-class citizen in our school. Just because he's black doesn't mean he's a second-class citizen. Just because he's not an Anglo-Saxon doesn't mean that he's a second-class citizen. So after I got through with him, shaming him, he said, well, come on, and we'll risk it. And it did. Well, I think those things removed us from the area of trouble when we were integrating the university.
That, I think, is an example of strong leadership as well as courage. It's also been said that the strong leadership you exerted in the late 1960s, early 1970s, during the time of the Vietnam War and student protest, was what kept Morehead from coming apart completely. I know those were difficult times. I witnessed them. And I know they were difficult for you. What was it like dealing with those?
John, they were trying times. They were emotional times. Many of the colleges and universities in the nation were closing because of student protests and student strikes. Students were occupying presidents' offices and wouldn't let the administration in. They were burning buildings on campuses that were dedicated to military affairs. You remember this incident quite well, that when some students were killed at Kent State, and some students were killed at Jackson State. The students were all upset about that something ought to be done to reduce the tension over Vietnam and these protests on campus. And so the students were debating on how they were going to handle me in this thing and what my reaction would be. Well, they had a wake one night, a meeting to talk about it, and they came down and asked me to go and speak to them. Well, I went on the auditorium steps, and they were all out in front, and I spoke to them about our responsibility, which was different to the responsibilities of the President of the United States. There's some of the things they were talking about that resided in the decision of the President of the United States, not the President of Morehead State University, and thus and so. And finally, when I got through, I said we ought to pray about this matter, and I dismissed them, if you remember, in a prayer. Everybody quietly went back to the dormitory. That was the only evidence of protest that ever came to be a united effort upon the part of the students to get my attention and the attention of the university.
Dr. Doran, after 23 years as president of Morehead State University, you decided to retire. When did you know it was time to retire?
Well, John, I guess I was sort of like Wayne Wright at the University of Florida. When he retired, I think I sort of had presidential fatigue. I was really beginning to get tired. My energy level was not as high as it was, and I just could not commit myself to the hard drive and hard push that I'd done for 23 years. I guess that had something to do with it. But more than that, too, I think I had seen the end of an era, that I had done about all that I could muster enthusiasm to do. We had built enough and adequate buildings. We had the machinery set up to interpret the university in the region and recruit students. We had in place a most excellent faculty and most excellent young administrators. And I think that Mignon and I decided that this is time for us to let somebody else have it and get somebody else to build on the foundation we had laid and erect another element of the superstructure.
Dr. Doran, looking back over this long and very full life, very active life, politics, religion, and education, what do you think is your one proudest accomplishment?
I don't know that I have ever been inclined to isolate one mountaintop and say when I reached that top I achieved the greatest that there was to achieve. I think rather that there have been many mountaintops. Certainly there have been many valleys. I guess you don't have a mountain without a valley there, and I've gone through some of the shadows of the valley as well. I think achieving the presidency of Morehead State University and doing as well as we did and staying there 23 years must have been a mountaintop. And to have become Speaker of the House of Representatives was a great feat and a great achievement and a thing that I wanted at that time above anything else. Nothing else in politics ever came along that I wanted as intensely as I did that as a member of the House. That is a great mountain peak. And I think in the church to have come to a point that I have been associated with the ministry for 63 years. and still in favorably, relatively good standing with most of the neighborhood, is a pleasing, satisfying sort of situation to which I've achieved. But I think in it all, to have been associated with the outstanding educators in Kentucky that I have, the outstanding governors and political leaders in Kentucky I have, and the outstanding ministers of the church that I've been identified, all of these have been great influences, and I mark them as great memories.
What did you think of the program you just saw? KET would like your comments, and we invite you to call our 24-hour toll-free reaction line. Record your message at 1-800-926-7765 and let us know what you think about programs on KET.
Hello, I'm Harold Gould. Hanukkah is a time of celebration for family and friends.